The Great Depression. By 1930, we're seeing factories shutting down or at least cutting back on wages or employment. Production is down, unemployment is skyrocketing, and in fact, by 1932, 1/4 of the entire labor force is out of work. We have a 25% unemployment in the United States during that time period. And those who were still working, wages have definitely fallen. Personal income during this time period dropped by more than half. And the problem with this is that the Depression really became this vicious cycle. What you have is shrinking wages and unemployment means that this cuts into people's purchasing power. So less people are buying different consumer products. And so with less people, let's say, buying blenders, the blender industry decides, okay, well, we have to cut wages again or fire even more people, which leads to even more people not buying that item, blenders, which causes, once again, the industry to cut back wages. And you can see how this just keeps going over and over and over again. One group in particular that was hurt was farmers, because they had already been struggling before the Depression even started. You see men around the countryside losing their homes and their fields, and you have this dispossessed just roaming the countryside in hopes of getting any kind of work. But you also see people being evicted in the urban setting as well. A lot of people have to move in with their relatives in order to survive, while others will live in so-called Hoovervilles. That is a name that's literally showing bitterness directed at the president at that time. But these were basically shacks where people would shiver and suffer and starve. As you can see here, soup kitchens become a standard feature with lines stretching for blocks. The thing is, charities and local communities just can't meet the needs of everyone. And at that point in time, the state and federal government had no kind of welfare programs or unemployment compensation programs. To survive, people in urban settings might try to plot their own gardens in vacant lots or back alleyways. And a lot of times workers would resort to kind of a primitive communism, basically where they would share what they had with the people of their community. Very few people are going to escape this hard time. Women are also going to be affected just like men, but women generally were less likely to be fired by men, though they still suffered unemployment rates of about 20% by 1932. Part of the reason they're less affected, though, is because they were concentrated in jobs generally less vulnerable than industries that were male-dominated. But we are going to see, because there are so many men that are unemployed, this really renews opposition to female employment, especially female employment of married women. Basically, every state at this time is going to think about, if not actually implement, some sort of restriction on employing married women. Because the idea was that, oh, if you are a married woman, the man of the house should have a job first, and your income was just supposed to be supplemental at best. So let all the men have jobs before we give, married women jobs. 3/4 of the nation's schools would refuse to hire married women as teachers during this time, and 2/3 actually dismissed married teachers. Many other jobs are also going to fire married women. The idea was this would open up jobs then for men, except for it rarely produced jobs for men because very few men actually wanted positions in fields that were dominated by women. Sometimes they would take these jobs, but mostly this just hurt families more than anything else. The idea behind all of this, though, is once again, women, they didn't deserve equal opportunities. And so we're seeing that stiffened opposition to opening up men's jobs to women. Still, even with this, the proportion of married women in the workforce is actually going to increase because they had to work to help their families survive. 1/3 of working married women actually provided the sole support for their families. And that's the thing. Families are going to be extremely affected by the Great Depression. We're going to see divorce rates fall during the Great Depression because it's expensive to get a divorce, but desertion increase. So this would be where a man or a woman just deserted their family. Generally, marriage tended to be postponed. The birth rate fell, partly because of postponed marriage and partly because they might be second guessing having a second child or third child, or et cetera, et cetera. We see men, when they're fired, would be basically humiliated. And this would be, husbands and fathers. And this could lead to suicide, to just a loss of energy. If you ever get fired from something, even when it wasn't your fault or anything and it's just a layoff, it's still like a really huge blow to one's ego. Women, on the other hand, their responsibilities oftentimes grew. Suddenly, female-headed households that are homemakers has kind of a new significance because they can sew their own clothing. They can raise and can their own vegetables. A lot of this is kind of reversing those trends of consumerism we saw during the 1920s. Also, women might do more, like take on boarders or take on washing for others. And of course, children are affected as well. They feel the tension and the fear, even if they were still surviving. And we do see incidences like parents starving in order to make sure that their children didn't. And yet still many children went without food. In fact, we have children dying of starvation and malnutrition during this time period. A lot of other children as well had to stay home from school or church because they lacked like shoes or the proper clothing in order to attend these kinds of facilities. We see a lot of teenagers would leave home. On one hand, it would be like escaping parental authority, but a lot of times it was making the choice to leave home so that there was more food so that their younger siblings would be able to survive. And so teenage runaways are going to suffer from starvation, exposure, illness, and just accidents. And then minorities are extremely affected as well. It's particularly going to harm racial minorities because, generally speaking, racial minorities had fewer resources and fewer opportunities before the Great Depression anyway. This means that they're less able to absorb economic pain. They're going to have less in their savings in case of an emergency and such. African Americans, you hear the term last hired, first fired in regards to them, because that's exactly what happened. That if there was someone hiring, an African American would be the last person they would want to hire. And if they did hire them and ended up having to fire someone, the African American person would be the first to be fired. Therefore, unemployment for African Americans was more than twice that of white people's. They're also limited in their assistance. A lot of times charities would just refuse outright to help Black people at all. And when the government had relief eligibility for African Americans, their eligibility tended to be higher and it provided them with less. So you get African Americans basically forced to crowd together in already cramped apartments and paying exorbitant rents. And it's not just African Americans who are affected. We also have other racial minorities like Hispanics suffering. A lot of times they'd be displaced in the agricultural labor force, even out in like California where they had made up a large percentage. A lot of times the government would bar them from certain public works and like highway construction jobs. In fact, you get like vigilantes during this time, threatening employers who hired a Mexican worker rather than a white American. In fact, this is going to drive nearly 500,000 Mexican immigrants and their American-born children from the United States. And this was openly encouraged by the United States Immigration Service, who in fact would have like raids and round up people and demand immediate proof of citizenship. And so you have this fear of deportation, meaning that if you were an illegal immigrant, or even if you were a legal immigrant, there's this concern that you might be deported. And so a lot of them do not look for relief. When it comes to protest and reaction, Quite frankly, most Americans reacted without protest. Many blamed themselves for their own plight. The protests that people did do, a lot of times was about like protecting their families. Most of the time it was small, like stealing food or coal, though there was more dramatic, like holding a city council hostage in New Jersey, things like that. And then more formal forms of protest would be, joining communist groups or socialist groups or just other radical groups. Still, local officials are going to suppress protests. And in rural areas, a lot of these protests were more about like stopping the shipment of produce to the market, because if they stopped that shipment, that would drive up the price, and therefore maybe they could make more on their own shipment, or trying to prevent like the foreclosure on farms so that they could continue to try to survive even through just subsistence farming, if nothing else. So looking at all of the issues and all of the causes of the Great Depression, how do we fix the Great Depression?